Hey y'all, happy Monday and welcome to another episode of Tech Backstage. With me today, Cody Eddings, the CEO of SnapRefund. Cody, how you doing?
Doing great, Eddie. Thank you for having me. How are you?
I'm good, man. Thanks for taking the time to be on the show. I know that Monday is always a busy day, so appreciate you taking a little bit of time out of your day to sit down and chat with us.
Of course, my pleasure.
So before we dive into the topic, one thing we always like to do, sit down and just talk quickly about who you are, where you're from, kind of your origin story, I like to call it, how you got from where you used to be to being CEO of Snap Refund for our viewers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's probably a longer story than I'll even give it credit for, but I'm just a big nerd, really, when it comes down to it. I love tech. I've been an engineer, my whole career. Always been an entrepreneur. I'm from St. Louis, so I grew up there, came to the East Coast, live in Philadelphia now. My co-founder in Snap Refund, his name is Denise Taylor. He'd approached me back in 2019, and he said, "Hey, there's a problem I see. People in minority communities, low socioeconomic backgrounds, et cetera, don't typically have good financial literacy, and they tend to get technology in the finance space after it's already been adopted, by the mainstream. So we set out to solve those problems." And that's really how my life has been ever since, is trying to solve those problems. So here we are
That's
in
awesome.
2022, and it's been a long road, but it's been really rewarding.
Very cool. So you founded Snap Refund in 2019, you said?
That's right.
Cool. And then before you were at Snap Refund, just to give everybody a little bit of background about or like a little bit of history about your background, tell us some of the other companies that you might have worked for, and maybe some of the like high level achievements that you had as an engineer before you decided to take on this journey of entrepreneurship.
Yeah, sure. I'm about to make a lot of my old managers happy with some shout outs. So I used to work, my first job after college was, I got a degree in computer engineering. I should take a step back. And with that, you can go hardware, software. I took more of the software path. So I started working as a systems engineer for SCADA systems for solar farms at a company called Grand Tech, based out of Allentown, Pennsylvania. So that's essentially I would write logic that would help the client company who owns a solar farm track all kinds of metrics and data on how the solar farm is performing based on all these sensors. It would be on all the panels and across the farm, and then it would all feed back into these really old school computers called PLCs. Then after that, I started working. I wanted to do something a little more user centric. It was very industrial. And I started as an Android engineer at a Philly startup called Roar for Good. And they were making a female empowerment based panic button. Essentially, their company was meant to help bridge some of the gaps around safety and peace of mind for women in cities. And then I was building their Android app that would connect to this Bluetooth panic button essentially, and they ended up pivoting and they put that in hotels and healthcare settings for workers because there's now legislation around that. So then I started working for Urban, URBN is the parent company of Urban Outfitters, and I was lead Android engineer there for a few years, where I built this suite of kiosk style apps that, ironically, I guess I kind of went back to industrial applications. So I started building these apps for their warehouse that run this like 100 million ARR plus operation every year. And I would make these dedicated apps to help with their clothing rental business called Newly There. So those were the 9 to 5 jobs I had up to that point. But the entire time, even going back before my first official job, Grand Tech, after college, I'd always been trying to do my own thing, make these products that people would actually find some value in. So my first company was called GS Technologies. I built a guitar simulator app called Guitar Sim, pretty aptly named, I guess. And then after that, I made a dog toy called the Chase It, which is basically like a remote control car with this like rubberized shell, so my dog could, get all his fun, just like going after something full speed in the field. And then after that, that's when Anise and I started Snap Refund.
Very cool, dude. Yeah, I wanted to just highlight that because looking at your background, you've had some pretty cool positions, and I think it's always fun to talk about, being a lead engineer, on a product that, like you said, does 100 million a year in annual recurring revenue. Those are huge numbers, and I think it's also important to highlight that versus the backdrop of being an entrepreneur, right? Because there's a lot of similarities in there being like a lead Android engineer, but there's also a lot of differences. I'm a engineer as well, so it's like there's so many things about being, especially a CEO, and this is something that I always like to talk to people about because I find it so hard to try and be a CEO and an engineer at the same time because you're in such different headspaces, right? So tell me a little bit about, just quickly before we jump into the topic, talk to me about the early days of SnapRefund and just how you guys got started and what how it evolved once you guys did get started.
Yeah, for sure. So it all started from that conversation I had with my co-founder. But even beyond that, I think it would be selling the story short to not talk about all the pivots we went through. And I mean, it's really hard. It's still really
Yeah.
hard. Like starting a business is just hard in general. So we started off essentially trying to do peer-to-peer payments, and we realized that our mission, I guess I should say, first of all, has always been to empower people, give them greater control over their money. So the way you can do that can look like a lot of different things. So we started off as a peer-to-peer payment app. We actually called ourselves Dime back then. Yeah, funny story. We were just trying to think of good nouns that could also become verbs, but that's neither here nor there, I suppose. We realized that the product space for peer-to-peer payments is already really saturated, and a lot of people already have pretty solid access to a lot of those tools, via the other peer-to-peer apps that are out there. There's a lot of them. So rather than try to make a solution where it honestly wasn't really as needed, we felt we wanted to apply the instant payment technology we've been building from day one since we started in November 2019 to a space that really needed it. And that was the insurance space we come to find, because business to consumer payments, out of all the payment types, that one tends to get the least amount of attention and innovation. Not saying it's for lack of trying, but people haven't focused as heavily on it as like peer-to-peer or even business-to-business payments, for example.
Hmm.
So we saw there was this need in the insurance space because a lot of it's paper check, very manual stuff.
Right.
And there's a lot of sensitivity around the payment itself, because that's why you have insurance, is so when it's
Right.
time to get paid, you get paid.
Yeah.
So it seemed like a really high value place to be able to provide a solution for people. And through the course of, a few years, really, we continually found better and better product market fit to reach where we are today, where we're focusing really heavily on the dental insurance space and P&C insurance, where we can expedite claim payments for people.
Very cool, dude. That's great. And man, I love what you just said about the pivot, because I was just having a call with some people right before this, and we were talking about the reverse pyramid and how you start with this really broad, like, hey, we do all of these different things, and then all of a sudden you start kind of like narrowing it down until you start getting into like you said, that product market fit, which is where you want to be, and really
Absolutely.
finding your home. So I think it's funny that that's come up two times in one day for me. That's
Yeah,
great,
it's a
dude.
recurring theme, to say
Yeah,
the least.
for sure. Cool. So I want to dive into the topic because I think we're cruising along here, and I think it's a really important topic, something that I'm really passionate about. But today we're talking about equitable apps, right? About equitable software products and building software for people over product. Um, I think this is hugely important right now, but I'd love to hear a little bit about your thoughts on equitable software products and what it means to build a product that's equitable for people instead of it being a for-profit application.
Yeah, this is a topic that matters a lot to me because I've been an Android engineer, I've been a mobile developer. So I've been the person who has to actually bring these ideas to life, more than one time in my career. And with that, there's always this idea, I think, that you really want to make sure that what you're building has the most benefit for as many people as possible, but not everyone views it that way, surprisingly. So I've been on teams before where they might have decided, well, let's just build an iOS app only, for example, because it makes the product appear more premium. And
Hmm.
that's a dangerous path. I think it's an
Right.
unethical decision, because
Yeah.
what you're doing is you're creating forced scarcity. And we don't really have to have that. Like, what's the
Hmm.
point of making something scarce when you have the resources to provide it to everyone? If you really think that what you're doing benefits people, then you would ideally want that to get into the hands of as many people as possible. And of course, there's business considerations. You can't just always put all your resources into mobile development, for example, just using that as one particular use case of this. But in general, I think it's important to have this compass in your mind when you're making anything, especially software, that's supposed to help people, that it really is about them, and it's not about you trying to create or position yourself as this, very luxurious, unobtainable thing that only a small crowd of people deserve to have. And I think that's an important distinction to make.
Yeah, and I think it's important too. I mean, I go through these, through these calls numerous times a month, even sometimes numerous times a week. But and especially when you're talking about building mobile applications, the question almost always gets posed when you're talking about budget and building out on iOS and Android, and they're like, well, what if we just do it on one type of device, right? Because then you're like, well, yeah, I mean, because having an iOS team and an Android team, it's hard and it's expensive, and like you got to have very specific people for both roles, unless you're using a cross-platform solution like React Native or something like that. But even still, there's intricacies involved. But what's the statistic? It's something that like the majority of people, are on like a $200 or less device, and they don't have access to, the types of internet that you have that, are hardwired into your home, right? So anytime you're talking, and again, I'm kind of like paraphrasing here because I can't remember the exact stat, but like most people do not have, an iPhone 13 Pro on 5G. And especially if you're developing for the rest of the world as well,
Oh,
those
totally.
stats go down even more significantly, right?
Oh,
So,
yeah.
I don't know. I mean, has your team done any research into accessibility, device accessibility, things like that? Are there any like surprising stats that you guys have found as were building out these applications?
Yeah. So what's interesting is globally it's a totally different landscape, for a lot of reasons, of course. But a lot of people now, I forget how many billions of people are on the internet to date, right? But that number keeps increasing and will probably continue to increase. But I think we're close to, if not a little past or a little under the halfway mark of, I think around 3.5 billion people, maybe. Don't quote me on the number, but somewhere around there, people actually have access now. What that looks like for most people is, like you said, actually usually Android devices, because
Yeah.
a few reasons. Number one, the price. I mean, that's huge. People in developing nations, for example, are typically going to have an easier time affording an Android device over an iOS device because of the way Apple intentionally prices their products, right? So without getting too hard on the Android fanboy train, because I ride it,
Yeah.
it's around 85% of all smartphones worldwide are Android devices, and that number changes, but it's the majority, by a very healthy margin. So that leaves you in this place where you have to also think of, okay, is that applicable to what we're doing today? Now, for example, SnapRefund, we only have a web app to date. So we went platform agnostic by making sure that everyone with our MVP could access the platform at SnapRefund.io, well, app.snaprefund.io for the web app in particular. It's about 50-50 in the US is the split between iOS and Android devices. And that number is going to keep changing and ebbing and flowing. But what that really means is, if you really want your app to reach a broad market, you probably need to just launch it on both. And if you can't, that's okay, but you need to make a really educated decision on who you're actually targeting, which device you're more likely to have. And I think like the tip I would give anyone is just make a web app. If you're really trying to start from a middle ground standpoint, like every phone can access the internet, right? So just get on Chrome or Safari, whatever you use, and then just go to your website, you'll be fine. But even from that, you can start to discern real usage analytics from your actual traffic and say what percentage of devices accessing the site are iOS versus Android. And even that can give you a more educated decision if you have to make one app before the other, that you could at least say, okay, well, we know that the majority of our users are iOS or the majority are Android, so let's make sure we make that one first so we can just service the existing users. Where it gets really interesting, and I know this isn't even necessarily answer your question, but is worth noting, certain things, I think you have a moral responsibility to provide even if economically it might be difficult for you. So for example, like a banking app, even if the majority of your users are Android users, but there's some people who are iOS users, banking is something that's so important that you ideally wouldn't want anyone to be unable to use it, right?
Right.
So in certain cases, I think it's really important to give context to what you're building to make sure you say, if this really is a critical part of someone's life, then we can't really afford from a societal standpoint to exclude people, because that's how a lot of systems get perpetuated of
Yep.
inequity.
Yeah, I agree, and you're actually going to force me to show my hand here. But as much as you're an Android guy, I'm a web guy, and I'm a big believer in, for MVPs, progressive web apps are the way to go, because the barrier to entry is so low. Like you said, as long as you
Absolutely.
have a device with access, you can generally get online and do something about it, right? But this conversation goes so much deeper than devices, right? It really does, because I remember, and I can't talk about specifics, but I remember having a call with a client not too long ago, and we were actually talking about socioeconomic situations for end users, and this particular end user was definitely like lower mid class, maybe even a little bit below that, right? And so now when you start talking about banking and stuff, you start talking about things that have a huge impact on the way that people live their lives, right? And they're things that this goes back to, like, what are the basic rights that a person has, right? And you're talking about, you know upper middle class people, and the top 1% having access to all these tools that, I think there's even studies that show this, that having access to those tools gives them the advantage, and they have access to the education, and things like that. So when you're talking about building applications, and I tend to agree with you on the moral obligations, right? Like, I got into, and I mean, there's obviously people that disagree with both of us, right?
Of
Um,
course.
but I'm the same as you. Like, I got into building software because I felt like we could do good with it. Like, you could have a large impact, not just in your local region, in your city or your state, but you could potentially affect the globe with your product, right? So I agree. I think that there's kind of this moral obligation that not only are we trying to you know do good and do better, but also that we don't want to be excluding people from our applications, right? And I think that
Absolutely.
those are things that we're fighting right now in society as well, not just with applications, but it also goes down to access to education, and the types of the quality of schools in neighborhoods that have higher average household salaries versus uh poor neighborhoods. And so I think that what you're talking about right now is, you're talking about addressing larger problems that we're having, not just in the US, but in the world. But you're talking about it developing a product, right?
Exactly.
So, yeah, and I think that that's huge. And the other thing is too, that I think there's a really important distinction to make here, is like, when you're talking about building applications, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. But when you're building applications for people over profit, that doesn't mean you have to be a not-for-profit organization, right? It just means that you're prioritizing people over monetary gains. And sometimes that means making decisions that are like, hey, you know what? We could make $20 more a person per month if we did this, but it's not the best, it's not the best equitable solution for all people.
Absolutely. It takes a lot of, I don't know if I should call it courage,
Yeah.
or and there's something that I think you have to, in your head, you have to come to a point where you think, like, look, even if I specifically don't stand to gain as much out of doing this thing, it's still worth doing. And that's not something that you can really, you know, you can't really fake it. Either you're actually doing something for those reasons or you're not. And
Yeah.
if you are, I completely think you should always keep a part of your entire outlook on your business dedicated to that, because that's what drives long-term benefit, I think, for everyone as a whole. Like you mentioned, thinking about these problems from local levels all the way up to the global level. The only thing anyone can really do individually is just what they can control, which is like their own life, their own business, how they choose to spend their working hours, what they want to work on, all that. If you take that and you do the best you can at trying to further some sort of equitable playing field for everyone, that's the best thing I think any one of us can do individually to try to help solve these problems at a more systemic level.
Yeah, I agree. I'd love to hear a little bit about how you approach solving these types of problems, maybe personally, but also within your organization, because I think sometimes maybe the I'm not going to say the right answer, but the best path forward maybe isn't always clear. So how do you approach building an application that's equitable and puts people over profit? Like what's your personal approach? And then maybe if you want to share some insights from the way that SnapRefund handles it as well, I'd love to hear them.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think in general, right, I try to always think, if I was a user of this and I didn't have any affiliation with the company beyond actually just consuming its product, what are the things that I would hope they were doing? And what are the conversations that I would hope are being had, knowing that I'm not actually in the room? So that's the overall mindset. When I talk to Anise, my co-founder, I'm always thinking like, all right, how do we do right by our users ultimately? This isn't really like a particularly groundbreaking or crazy idea. I think it's just important to always have empathy. And that goes both ways. Like it's empathy for appreciating what it's like when you don't have the decision-making power and how you still want to be, acknowledged and thought of in those conversations when you're not there. So that's
Right.
huge. A story actually where this was pretty relevant with us, SnapRefund did a penetration test. It's actually underway right now. And we were doing this test, and I was talking to my co-founder before we started, and I was thinking, okay, should we do this? Should we not? I wanted to have a conversation. And we were going back and forth. We have more features coming out, of course, more platform updates. Like that's an ongoing thing for a software company. So we were thinking, oh, like, is it better to wait? We have some more stuff coming out in the pipeline. It's going to be pretty important. Do we want to hold off till then? And then, in the conversation, we had come to the conclusion that it's not really a matter of, should we do it? It's really a matter of, can we do it? Because it should be done is the answer. I mean, we have real data. We transacted over $48,000 since we launched in March of this year. So we have real users, people on the platform. We've done a lot in regards to security already. But as soon as we start to think like we've done enough, or we don't need to invest any more dollars in this because we've already done X, Y, and Z so far last quarter, I think that's where you get into this risky territory where, I mean, if I was a user of an app and I knew that it had my data, or I've done transactions, whatever it is, maybe it's just social media, it has my pictures. And if I know that there was an opportunity for them to be proactive with an approach that wasn't really about profit, but was more about making sure that it was the best possible thing for me as the user, then I'd want them to have done it. And that's the guiding philosophy that I tend to approach these things with nowadays. And thankfully, I have a really amazing team, and my co-founder is always really good at keeping us both on track and making sure that we're giving full discussion and breadth and depth to these conversations when they come up.
Yeah, I love that too, especially in regards to, you're talking about data right now. I think there's a lot going on in the world with data right now, and even machine learning and AI, and talking about the ethical approaches to using data. And I love that approach that you're talking about. And the thing about it, I think, at least this is my opinion, is that you're right that it's simple, right? It's simple to think that thought, like, oh, like what would I like this to, or if I wasn't the founder of this company, what would I like it to do, right? But I think the execution of that's a little bit more difficult, because you have to be taking a purposeful approach to these things, and you have to be continually asking yourself that, on a daily basis, as you guys are starting to roll out new features. And you have to it's an iterative process, right? You're like, oh cool, so the last time we rolled out that feature, we were making sure that we weren't using user data unethically, and then but now we got this new feature. It's like, and you have to like continually reevaluate yourself to make sure that at some point, and I think Facebook is the easy example here, is like Mark Zuckerberg testifying that, oh, hey, we don't know where all our data is used right now, right? It's like, well, at what point did that happen? Like, because you guys weren't like consuming data the way that you are right now, like when you were writing this for college kids. So it's like, at what point did you just be like, okay, it's open, it's open season on user data here? So I think that's where it gets really hard, right? Especially when you're trying to find product fit or product market fit, and you're trying to work on scaling your business. How do you make sure that you stay true to being empathetic to your users and making sure that you're continually like kind of having an integrity check with yourself and your founding team and the people that work for you, and like, hey, are we still on track with our mission as a company, and are we still putting people over money? And I think that's where you start to like really have to put the you really have to kind of just get in there and do it, and just make sure that daily you're just having that integrity check, right?
100%. And it's
Yeah.
always easier to think you're doing something than actually do something, which is an important distinction to make. I mean, I could
Yeah.
think all day like, we're a super secure company, we're doing enough. And that's just from a security standpoint. It's not even considering
Yeah.
like the ethical, moral obligations of everything else that goes into running a company. But to actually practice making sure that you're doing it and being open to feedback on if you're doing it, I think is really where like the rubber meets the road, so to say.
Yeah. There you go. Yeah, I 100% agree. Is being open to the feedback, and then also, being open to using that feedback to help you build a better product, a more equitable product. I think 100% agree with you on that. We got a few minutes left here. I'd love to sit down and kind of like shift focus a little bit, talk about the future of SnapRefund, future tech. What are you excited about that you guys are working on right now? Obviously nothing too top secret, but love to hear a little bit about what you're excited about for what's to come. What your team's working on, but also how that relates back to the topic of, how do we continue to keep ourselves accountable as we're building into the future? And because as we move into the future, it's going to be even more data consumption. It's going to be even more machine learning. And like, how do we continue to stay ethical in an ever changing tech environment?
It's a great question. It's one that a lot of money is spent every year at massive corporations trying to answer, and hopefully they come to the right ones. But
Yeah.
it's a process. So, I mean, your users, I think, deserve to get some of the cool top secret stuff, anyways, right? Your listeners. So I'll make sure to not cut any corners. So we've got some pretty exciting stuff coming out. So SnapRefund, at its core, as a fintech, we have this instant payment processing platform where businesses and people can transact and things settle in a couple seconds, even on nights and weekends. So no
Wow.
more multi-day ACH delays, right? And these technologies are going to become more and more prevalent. That's just the direction that global commerce is going to go, organically. But what we're looking at in the dental insurance space, there's a big problem right now. When I go to the dentist, depending on my insurance plan, quite often providers, aka the dentist office, is going to make me as the patient pay out of pocket even when I have insurance, and then I'm going to get repaid by my insurance company a few weeks later. It's like 2 weeks on average, sometimes as long as 6 weeks, 8 weeks, depends on the insurance company. So that's obviously a problem for the majority of people in this country. They live
Totally.
paycheck to paycheck. So it's not like
Yeah.
I just have like, a bunch of money in my wallet waiting to get spent on like a new crown or something.
Yeah.
Spending $1,000 on that and then not being able to feed my kids with that money or pay my rent with that money for a few weeks while I wait for a check to come back to me is just an unnecessarily inequitable inefficiency. So we're solving this issue by partnering with insurance carriers and using our instant payment tech to integrate with their claims management systems. Or, I mean, this is super secret, but not really, because I'm going to say it to everyone, of course, is that we're also building out automated claim approval technology. So these claims, when they come in, they can go through the existing approval process with the carrier today, or we can help automate that process. And then when the claim's approved, at the end of that is our tech that's going to push the payment out at instant speed and it's going to settle to the insured in a few seconds. The insured is the patient.
Wow.
These are just insurance terms. People also say claimant. That's technically a third party, like someone who's making a claim against your insurance. But in the case of dental, the patients and the insureds are the same person.
Very
so
cool.
Now that situation, thank you, changes from I'm paying $1,000 when I go to the dentist and then getting a check back for, $500 in 2 weeks to I'm paying my $1,000 I'm at the dentist, but while I'm still in the chair, the $500 that my insurance carrier owes to me is already getting settled instantly in my account.
Yeah, that's incredible. And that's so cool because I think it's so crazy that not only do you have to pay the insurance premium up front, but then you're the one that has to foot the bill for it, for them to decide whether or not they're going to approve the claim and then send you the money afterwards. So it's like you're on the hook for the initial premium, then you're on the hook for the deductible, but then you're also on the hook for the insurer's part until they decide that it's okay. It's always just been kind of a ludicrous system to me. So I think that's a really cool that's a really cool product, and I think that's a really cool solution to I think, for lack of a better term, a broken industry right now, right?
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. And I mean, I call it broken myself sometimes too. I got to watch out for the insurance
Right.
snipers.
Yeah. I was gonna say
With
nobody's like watching us, right?
the red dots on us.
Yeah.
But one note about that as well that's really important is, well, like 1 in 8 is about the number that my teams come to in our research of underbanked adults in this country, people who don't have bank accounts or use
Wow.
payday lending, check cashing, third-party services. So that in and of itself is a problem. When you're giving someone a check, 1 in 8 people can't even cash the check without going to some check cashing place where they're charging some crazy fee to do it. So a big tenet of building with equity in mind, or equitability, is we made sure that those instant payments can settle even to people without bank accounts. So you can go get a reloadable gift card off the shelf from a corner store. As long as it's OCT enabled, you can get that instant payment from the carrier settled to you in seconds. So even without a bank account now, you're still getting the latest and greatest payment availability that someone else who's not part of the underbanked demographic has. And that is a huge tenet of making sure that everyone is empowered and has greater control over their money at the core of our mission.
Incredible, dude. That's awesome. We're out of time, but man, love the idea, love where you guys are going with this, and thanks so much for taking the time to speak with me today on a Monday. Carlos, do you want to pop in really quick and just give us the rest of the schedule for the week?
Certainly. Thank you, Eddie, and thank you, Cody. Okay. Well, tomorrow, no, I'm sorry, not tomorrow. Wednesday, we're going to be speaking with, right here, at the bottom where it says Owen McAndrews at Sprout Social. Looking forward to that one. Sprout Social is a very, very well-known platform. And then finally, next on Thursday, we're going to be talking to Carl Dietrich from Jump Arrow. And finally, on Friday, down below, we're going to be speaking with Corey Cossack at Aspireship. So those are the 3 upcoming shows that we have confirmed for this week, Eddie.
Cool. Thanks, Carlos. And Cody, thanks again for stopping by. Hope everybody has a good afternoon, and we'll see you on Wednesday.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me, gentlemen.
Thank you. Bye.